Hello, I'm Perrin Beatty, and welcome to the Business of Business. Throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, we'll be having a series of conversations with government officials, experts, and senior business people to talk about the impacts of the pandemic on Canadian business and how the business community has been responding. My guest today is John Stackhouse. John is the Senior Vice President in the Office of the CEO at RBC Canada. But by training, John is a journalist. He's been a foreign correspondent. He's an author. He was editor of the Globe and Mail. He's someone who has been a policy expert. He's someone as well who's been a banking executive for the last several years. So very much the Renaissance man. John, welcome. We're delighted to have you on the Business of Business.
Great, thank you, Perrin. It's wonderful to see you even from this distance.
John, recently RBC published a think piece that was called Small Business Big Pivot. Why were you focused on small business, and what were your findings as you looked at the impact of COVID-19 on smaller businesses in Canada?
No, thanks for highlighting the report. We think this is critical for policymakers as well as business leaders to come to grips with. When the crisis hit and there was this induced shutdown of the economy, we certainly saw in our business a disproportionate impact on smaller clients. And as we started to look at the economic data, labor force data included, we saw that growing by the week. So we began to explore it with the economics and thought leadership team, put together a database to understand what was going on. And then went out and spoke to 20,000 or so clients through surveys across the country to, as we got into April and the very dark weeks of the crisis, understand what was going on. And of course, in hindsight, things are a little clearer. And one of the things we now see in hindsight is that since the last crisis, Canada's economic expansion through the 2010s was really driven by small business, SMEs more broadly. And that's excellent for the economy. We may have taken a few things for granted, though, which really hit when the crisis hit. And as we note in the report, there were a few factors that we weren't really thinking through well enough in advance. One is the small liquidity buffer that most SMEs have for understandable reasons. But when you get hit with a shock like this, you don't have the buffer. Cash reserves, 2 months typically. We're well beyond that. And one of the reasons for that is the small margins and the lack of scale that we can get to in the discussion that most Canadian SMEs have. The other factor that we discovered in our analysis is the disproportionate exposure that SMEs have to the physical economy. They deal with people in person and didn't have a digital safety net, if you will, for when the lockdown came to the degree that larger enterprises might have had. And this really put them behind the eight ball in those weeks. So we wanted this report to shed some light on that, but then be forward-looking, which is to the point of the big pivot of what can we do to ensure that we're better prepared for a small business recovery into a more digital economy that we think lies ahead.
When you looked at it, what we see when we look at the Canadian economy is that the impact of COVID-19 has been very uneven, sector by sector and even region by region. Did you find the same thing applied in the small business sector?
Oh, absolutely. And it's one of the reasons that SMEs were hit so hard. So accommodation and food services and retail are the most evident ones and really hit by physical distancing. And what we've seen with restaurants, for instance, moving to a delivery model. A lot of good innovation going on, but now you can see sort of in hindsight, they weren't ready for it. They're catching up. So how do we help them accelerate that into the recovery? But it's not just the businesses that we see out on Main Street. Oil and gas and mining services firms, not sort of iconic SMEs maybe in the Canadian imagination, hit very hard by this. Lots of wholesale firms that aren't evident to the general public also hit very hard for that. No doubt key members of the chambers across the country. So it's both the iconic firms that we know, the mom and pop shop firms that we know, but also a lot of the key players that aren't so visible in the Canadian economy who didn't have that digital flexibility.
Now, in terms of your recommendations flowing from your findings, you had 5 key sets of them. Can you touch on some of those?
Absolutely. I mean, first and foremost, we need to transition some of the relief programs as we move into this next phase. For understandable reasons, the initial relief was geared at households. We had to find ways to help people stay at home without impoverishing themselves and therefore leading to people going out and engaging in risky social interaction. By and large, that worked. Maybe not enough emphasis was put on SME support during that time. Some adjustments have been made. It was all done very quickly, so it was good that governments learned and pivoted themselves. But as we go to the reopening, how do we ensure that the tens of billions of dollars that are still committed and have yet to be spent start to be channeled to the business operators, especially the smaller ones in the country, that have got a couple of really tough quarters ahead of them? How do we keep them solvent? Back to that point about the liquidity challenge. How do we get them re-employing people and starting to gradually come out? There's no green light in this crisis. We're going to have amber, a yellow light for a while, maybe a flashing yellow. So the relief programs have to help business operators through that transition. And a couple of other points that I'll touch on in our recommendations that we hope are useful. As part of that transition, we need to understand that SMEs are going to have to invest a lot in PPE, and they don't necessarily have the resources or expertise that, say, a Royal Bank has. So how do we ensure that programs are set up through chambers and trade associations and boards of trade that help SMEs buy and implement and optimize their use of PPE so that their employees are safe and their customers are safe? We shouldn't take that for granted. The second challenge that we think is going to be fairly pressing over the summer is the number of SMEs that are going to have to operate at a well below an optimal level, say 50% capacity. They don't have the buffer to manage at 50% capacity without some sort of relief through the summer. Restaurants and stores are obvious examples, but it's not restricted to them. So how do we ensure that the support programs are tailored in a way that help a business owner operate at 50%, not because they're a lousy business owner and they can only get to 50%, but because that is about as high as you can get in this kind of phase 2 environment. So some pivoting there on the support side that we think can be useful. And then longer term, big investments in the digital pivot, which I'm sure we'll talk about.
You mentioned earlier the lack of liquidity that small businesses had, and the simple fact is they're not in a good position often to be able to absorb the sort of shock that would come from a medically induced coma like the one that the Canadian economy has been placed in. Did you have any sense from the research that you were doing as to how many small businesses in Canada are unlikely to survive this at all?
I hate to put a number on that, but certainly in our surveys, which we've shared with governments across the country, a very significant number of SMEs are not sure they're going to make it through the summer or at least the calendar year. And Perrin, as you know, what that does is it tightens everything up. People don't make the investments. They don't want to hire people back. They don't want to lay out money for PPE or new equipment or inventory. So the whole system gums up. And one of the points we tried to stress in the report is that during the last crisis, where we saw this kind of freezing of the system, it was more in the banking system, as well as the top end of the supply chain, the automakers are the classic example. And government supported them is to keep the economy flowing, to keep liquidity going between firms. We're at risk now that we've got the same behaviors taking place, maybe below our sight lines among SMEs. So we've shared the line which others have used, that last crisis was about being too big to fail. This crisis may be about being too small to fail, and we've got to ensure that the SMEs don't fail, not just for their own sake, but there's a whole interconnectivity that the economy depends on that we can't afford to tighten up. So there's and there's lots of smart and good people from BDC to the commercial banks and the chambers working on this, but we can't underestimate how much needs to be done in fairly short order.
You mentioned earlier that one of the concerns is that as people are struggling, there's a real question for them is how much longer can I go on? Can I attempt to stay open? Should I take on more debt, for example? One of the issues we found early in the lockdown was a concern about when the wage subsidy program would come. And when it was announced that it might take 4 or 5 weeks for the checks to flow, many businesses decided at that point they had no choice but to lay off staff. I think at this point, as we look at reopening, the question many businesses are asking themselves is, can I make a go of it? You mentioned the fact if you're operating at only a portion of capacity, and restaurants are a good example of that. Is it feasible to continue at all? And at what point do you simply cut your losses? The other factor that I'm wondering whether it came up in your research was that governments have postponed payments, whether it's tax payments or other payments that might have to be made. This helps to explain, I think, in part, why some businesses which had reported very low liquidity, have been able to survive longer than anticipated. But it means that they've accumulated a backlog of debt that is going to have to be paid. Are we coming up to a wall at some point where businesses are going to have to make a fish or cut bait decision as to whether to close entirely or to try to make a go of it?
That's such a good point, Perrin. There was a Wall Street Journal article in the last week that had documented the amount of cash reserves that American companies had taken on, and it was like a 5 times increase from before the crisis. So they're sitting on large piles of cash, not for bad reasons. They just are a little intimidated right now in terms of spending. And if you're an owner, yes, you have to make that decision. Do I take the cash that I've got and move it elsewhere, wind down the business a little bit? So we're going to need to look for incentives, nudges to get those businesses not just opening their doors, but buying equipment, hiring people, building up inventory, and drawing down those cash reserves. Not easy stuff, but I think there's going to be a fair bit of sort of public-private effort required. Governments are going to have to become a little more active out there in the economy, whether it's through procurement or getting infrastructure projects going, just to liberate some of that those assets that may be sitting on the sideline. And then we have to remember that SMEs particularly are disproportionate creators of jobs, something like 40% more per dollar in an SME versus a big company, which is why we saw such a big decrease in employment, a large increase in unemployment as SMEs shut down. Well, the same force can be at play in a positive way coming out of the crisis. So how do we ensure that SMEs are revving, hopefully not before long, up to 100%, and creating jobs in a powerful way that maybe larger enterprises won't be able to do?
John, often when we look at reports that get made looking at business issues, the question gets asked, I have a problem, what is the government going to do to solve it? What was unique about your report was that you simply didn't focus on what government can do, but also what the private sector can do. Can you talk to us about what the role of the bank should be, or what should be the role of other businesses in terms of helping SMEs?
Well, certainly from the bank's perspective, these are our clients. We need them to not only survive, but thrive. And we're working very actively and I would say creatively with clients. And as you know, it varies by sector, and even by client in terms of their own situation. There's no one size fits all, but we've got bankers across the country in every community working with clients to show as much flexibility as we can within our risk parameters. We're regulated to ensure that we're not causing excess risk for the system, but at the same time trying to help those clients get by, whether it's through deferrals or renegotiation of terms, and hopefully that goes constructively through the summer. We think, though, that there's a good opportunity for Team Canada to get back on offense. We've played a lot of defense lately. Maybe there's more offense we can start to show through the summer. We're working with a variety of organizations to ensure that there's some injection both of capital, but also of enthusiasm into the economy through the summer, to get Canadians buying more from Canadian firms, to get people back on Main Street, literally and figuratively, and getting that consumer spending into the Canadian economy. So love for everyone who's listening to be part of that. Please reach out to us, because this isn't an RBC thing. We think this is a Team Canada thing, and we're proud to be on Team Canada.
Now, your report noted, as so many observers have, that COVID-19 has accelerated the digitalization of society and of the economy, where people who previously didn't shop online to the same extent who would have gone into a store now are buying online. And so much of the activity is taking place there. And yet, historically, Canadian SMEs have been slow to go digital. Even the percentage of SMEs historically that have had their own websites has been low in Canada relative to other jurisdictions. You're arguing that one of the priorities should be to assist in this digitalization. What makes you feel that we'll be successful in doing that this time when adoption of digital technologies has been slow among SMEs in Canada in the past?
Well, let's hope, as they say, we're not going to let a good crisis go to waste, and that we all sort of see this as a moment of truth, where we can perhaps accelerate coming out of it. I think it's been a wake-up call for every business owner who's still functioning, and they probably the vast majority of them now realize they can't reopen and expand in the way that they might have in 2019. And we're trying to share this with clients as well as the general public. We see an enormous acceleration opportunity here coming out of the crisis for firms that invest in digital. I just did a podcast with Cadillac Fairview, which has 60, 70 properties across the country, a lot of SME tenants, and a concern that not enough of them are really leaning into the digital economy. And they've just launched a new initiative to turn the mall essentially into a digital platform. Make the mall like the Amazon, but one that you have in your hand, but you also have in your eyes as you're walking through it. This is how malls are in East Asia, in parts of Latin America. So a chance for us to accelerate out of this crisis by getting the software and hardware into the hands, let's say, of the shop owners in the mall, so that they're speaking to and interacting with their clients by phone. People are going to demand this. We're fairly confident in saying that we don't expect consumers to go back to what there was. Doesn't matter if you're a student in school or going to pick up something at the mall. We've developed habits over the last few months. We've adopted technologies. Just look at the downloads of apps in the last few months, the frequency of use of those apps. We see this in our banking apps, which is an opportunity for firms now as they look to get back on their feet, look to expand, to invest in the technologies and accelerate their growth.
Now, you also looked at the issue of international trade, and you mentioned that two trends there. The first is the growth of nationalism, where we're seeing borders being asserted much more than before, and I suppose we're seeing repatriation of manufacturing and of supply chains. You also mentioned localism as another factor. What are the impacts of this for small businesses, and what can be done to ensure that we don't see barriers going up for smaller businesses that prevent them from being able to access markets?
Well, both an opportunity and a serious challenge there. First of all, for the country, Canada has, thanks to leadership of people like you over the years, Canada has thrived economically by being an active, integral member of the global economy. We can't survive on our own, so we have to be always aware, almost paranoid about ensuring that we have that trade access. And just as important, that we're taking advantage of that trade access, which has always been a bit of a Canadian challenge. So no excuses there coming into the recovery. You mentioned localism, which is a big opportunity at the same time for a lot of providers to think about how do I engage with the a radius. You know, if I'm in southern Ontario or the Lower Mainland or in central Quebec, how do I engage with a big population base that I may not have touched before? We're seeing this in a number of firms we profiled in our report, that we're able to, because of this crisis, switch to a digital platform, and suddenly they're selling. We profile a clothing maker in Toronto who is now selling actively into the U.S. Previously, she didn't have time to even think about the U.S. market or know where to go. Now she's kind of focused entirely, not entirely, but significantly through her digital platform on the U.S. market. So a good example there of the opportunities, and there aren't going to be trade barriers against that kind of flow. So we can't be too intimidated by the talk of protectionism. It is serious to certain actors, but we also need to be a little more aggressive and ambitious as entrepreneurs to get our products and services into other markets.
One of the advantages that I've heard mentioned for smaller businesses is their ability to reimagine themselves and to pivot on a dime. You mentioned an example of one. Are there other examples that come to mind that of businesses that have retooled themselves entirely, reconceived who they are, and have been successful in doing that over the course of the pandemic?
One of my favorite stories, Perrin, is a woman in Vernon, BC, who runs a fitness studio. She essentially gives Zumba lessons. And suddenly the pandemic forced her to shut down. And in that classic, like only an entrepreneur would think this way, she said, I locked the doors to my studio and I sat down by myself for 2 hours. And I just thought, how can I get out of this problem? How can I fix this? Didn't turn to anyone for help. And then she recreated her business to now sell Zumba lessons through the internet globally. So she's got people now coming onto her platform from all over the world. She reached out to a Vancouver company that helped her sort of create this new platform. We'll see how it works out. It's not simple or easy, but I just love that spirit that as a country we've got to celebrate. Like, these are people who are just going to carry us on their shoulders in the years ahead. But let them take those chances because they don't want support. Sometimes they need a safety net, but they don't want and they're not going to wait around for the kind of support that some people talk about. So let's as we and this is something we stress to governments. Don't underestimate the spirit of the entrepreneur. And you can't program it. You cannot predict it as a government. Just let it happen. Give it space to happen. And when it happens, get behind it. Don't get in front of it, because you'll get run over by it. Get behind it. So hopefully, coming out of this crisis, we can have a bit more of that enthusiasm for entrepreneurs in the country. And as they're starting to accelerate, find out ways to support them.
So you've identified the group of entrepreneurs, the people who are incredibly inventive and have a real sense of drive to build something. But the report also talks about the fact that while Canada's a nation of small businesses, many small businesses don't have a desire for growth. All of us know instances of the so-called lifestyle business where if you go to someone and say, you must reinvent your business, his response is, look, I've got a cottage, I've got a car, the kids are through school, this is what I've lived my whole life to do, don't tell me I've got to reinvent it. Is there also a problem of an innate conservatism in the Canadian business community that is a cultural problem for us?
Yeah, absolutely. And we think this is, Perrin, coming to a head with a generational shift. A significant number, the median age of a small business owner is in their 50s versus early 40s for the general population. We see a lot, and this is frankly one of the reasons for conservatism right now, because they don't want to lose a business that they've built up over 30 years when they have retirement sort of within eyesight. So perfectly understandable. as those entrepreneurs maybe sort of get back on their feet, get their business back into a stable position, over the next 5 years, we'll see a lot of transitions, a lot of sales of businesses. What a great opportunity for a new generation that is digitally native, lives and breathes digital, millennials and Gen Z, to start to take over these businesses and create their own as well, and really catapult us as a country in the 2020s into kind of a really new frontier of digital business. But in the meantime, yeah, we've got a couple of barriers in this country. One is taxation. So Canada is a very good country to be a small business. Tax-wise, I mean, we can talk about all the nickel and diming that goes on around, but it gets a lot more challenging as you grow, and that becomes a bit of an unintended ceiling that we need to come to grips with. The other is geography. If you have a business, you almost have a geographic moat around you in Canada because we're far away from a lot of places. So if you're successful, like that fitness studio in Vernon, you probably control the local market. What the digital economy is teaching us, often painfully so, is there's no geography. Your competitors will come at you every second of the day from every part of the planet. And this crisis surely has been a wake-up call for that. All the owners who have said, I had no idea that, if I'm a restaurant, that someone's able to deliver food in this sort of way, this efficiently. Well, you know what? They've been doing that for a few years, and they're very good at it. So how do we help you get better at it? So I think we need to understand that we've had a bit of a wake-up call here in Canadian business, and we're entrepreneurial, we're competitive, we're focused. Let's come out of this crisis with our eyes on those future opportunities.
I suppose it's arguable that if small businesses are surrounded by that moat of geography, that the benefits of digitization are just that much greater for Canadian businesses if they suddenly can leap that moat.
Exactly.
And if they see a much larger market there. Exactly.
I mean, one of the challenges for entrepreneurs, they're busy with their business, so they don't want to get on a plane and fly to Austin, Texas, or let alone to India to make their sale. Well, now you don't have to get on a plane to make those sales. And I think Canadian entrepreneurs are discovering this in all sorts of ways, just as Amazon and Alibaba can drive all sorts of sales into this country. We also have platforms like Shopify that can get our products. Shopify is more global than just Canada, but it's a terrific platform for Canadian entrepreneurs to get their products to that unlikely customer who you never need to meet. The platform will make that connection for you, but you're not going to make that connection if you're not actively on that platform.
I want to come back to this question of risk aversion again, in that it's often said that in the United States that if you haven't tried and failed once, then you really haven't tried. The corollary of that in Canada seems to be if you've tried and failed, then you've failed. Can more be done in Canada to encourage greater entrepreneurship and to encourage greater risk-taking in this country?
Well, absolutely. Number one, and attitude is maybe the biggest driver there. We all have to be very comfortable with failure and not bemoan it so much in public or private discourse. And I'm not trying to belittle a lot of the pain that goes with business failure. We need to do better at even the forces of resilience, allowing businesses, enabling them to shut down more easily, more quickly. It's not the end of the world. And then to reorganize themselves and restart. So regulation in this country, both on the wind down and the wind up, can often be impediments. It's not just the attitude of the entrepreneur. We sometimes make it more difficult than we really should for those forces of resilience, as I've called them. So an opportunity here in the recovery to think about how do we ensure that businesses are able to wind down more quickly and efficiently, but also start up and accelerate more quickly and efficiently. There's no excuse in this day and age, but especially in this recovery, for someone to have to wait 6 months or 12 months for a permit to get a perfectly legal business going in any particular sector. So that, you know, the great work you're doing with the Resilience Network really can help sort of drive that. I don't think anyone's intentionally throwing down these roadblocks, but you create these little roadblocks, and then together they become very big ones. Let's flatten them, those roadblocks, so that those entrepreneurs who are hungry to get going can really accelerate.
Final question. Pull back to 30,000 feet and survey the landscape. When you look at it, how have things changed as a result of COVID? What are the permanent changes that are the lessons that we should be learning from this experience?
Well, we won't know for years, Perrin, about the social scarring, especially for younger generations, which I worry about a lot, and we can't underestimate. We should keep our eyes on that. I think more immediately, we need to be aware that social interaction and therefore economic interaction have fundamentally changed. People are going to work from home or work remotely. That already is the norm, and we'll have a blended model. Same with shopping. People are now consider it quite normal to order anything from anywhere, anytime, to be delivered anywhere. That's the norm. The same will be true in education and healthcare. It's this notion of distribution. It's a more distributed economy rather than a centralized economy. So for entrepreneurs and business owners, this is a terrific opportunity. You know, business thrives when there's change. So take advantage of the change. There's kind of movement of economic activity away from central hubs to more distributed centers, usually around the worker or the consumer. If you can take advantage of that change, you're going to have enormous opportunity in the next few years. But if you wait 6 or 12 months, you may find that someone else is already going to seize on that opportunity.
Fascinating insights that while we see tremendous damage that is done by the pandemic, it also creates, as in any crisis, it creates opportunities. But those opportunities go to the people who are supple and fast enough to identify them, to move quickly. John, we could have continued this for hours. It's fascinating, and perhaps we'll have a chance to come back to some of these themes in the future. But for today, thank you very much for your insights, and thank you for being a guest on the Business of Business.
Great, thank you, Perrin, and thank you for all the leadership that you've brought to the country. It is critical, and we're going to need it a lot more in the months and years ahead. So thank you.
Pleasure.